Hello, welcome to Heavy D Storytelling. Hopefully it will stop the circle of death soon. Okay, there it is. So, have we got a surprise for you? Okay, we're going to start with Philippians and then we're going to read a story. There's no synopsis, there's no joke of the day. We're just going to do Philippians and a story. All right. What's it doing? I'm glitching. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm not showing anybody on. Are you on? Hi, Rebecca. Nice to see you today. Kimmy doesn't need to send the links. Rebecca's already on. All right, this is Daniel. Stop telling me what to do. Philippians chapter 4. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible, and I don't have the link ready to post, so sorry about that. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am in, or I am, to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble, and you, Philippians yourselves, know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. There's Epaphroditus again. They got mentioned in the last book. A fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God, and my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. To our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. Greet every saint in Christ Jesus. The brothers who are with me greet you. All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit. That's the end of Philippians. Tomorrow we will start Colossians. And now we have a new surprise. Take 3.
Hi, everybody. Yes, okay. So I am going to be reading this book. Ooh, oh. This is the book that, this is the first book that I read that made me want to read and read and read and read and read. And I think that some of my kids understand that because they read this book too, and it made them want to read, 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 and read. And my sister. Okay, it is called Dragon Song by Anne McCaffrey. Okay, and it has a foreword, and some of these words are kind of big, and some of them are kind of, the story is kind of deep at points, but we'll get started, and I hope you love it. Okay. Forward. Rukbot in the Sagittarian sector was a golden G-type star. It had 5 planets, 2 asteroid belts, and a stray planet it had attached and held in recent millennia. When men first settled on Rukbot's third world and called it Pern, they had taken little notice of the stranger planet swinging about its adopted primary in a wildly erratic elliptical orbit. For 2 generations, the colonists gave the bright red star little thought until the path of the wanderer brought it close to its stepsister at Perihelion. Then the spore life, which proliferated at an incredible rate on the red star's wild surface, spun off into space and bridged the gap to Pern. The spores fell as thin threads on the temperate, hospitable planet and devoured anything organic in their way, seeking to establish burrows in Pern's warm earth from which to set out more voracious threads. The colonists suffered staggering losses in terms of people scored to death and in crops and vegetation wiped out completely. Only fire killed thread on land. Only stone and metal stopped its progress. Fortunately, it drowned in water, but the colonists could scarcely live on the seas. The resourceful men cannibalized their transport ships and abandoning the open southern continent where they had touched down, set about making the natural caves in the northern continent habitable. They evolved a 2-phase plan to combat thread. The first phase involved breeding a highly specialized variety of life forms indigenous to their new world, the dragons, named for the mythical Terran beasts they resembled, had 2 extremely useful characteristics. They could get from one place to another instantly by teleportation, and when they had chewed a phosphorine-bearing rock, they could emit a flaming gas. Thus, the flying dragons could char a thread to ash midair and escape its ravages themselves. Men and women with high empathy ratings or some innate telepathic ability were trained to use and preserve these unusual animals, partnering them in a lifelong and intimate relationship. The original cave fort, constructed in the eastern face of the Great West Mountain Range, soon became too small to hold either the colonists or the great dragons. Another settlement was started slightly to the north by a great lake conveniently nestled near a cave-filled cliff. Rotha Hold, too, became overcrowded in a few generations. Since the red star rose in the east, it was decided to start a holding in the eastern mountains, provided suitable accommodations could be found. The ancient cave-pocked cones of extinct volcanoes in the Bendon Mountains proved so suitable to the dragon men and women that they searched and found several more throughout Pern, and left Fort Hold and Rotha Hold for the pastoral colonists, the holders. However, such projects took the last of the fuel for the great stone cutters originally thought to be used for the most diffident mining, since Pern was light on metals, and any subsequent holds and wires were hand hewn. That means made them by hand. They made their cave homes by hand. The dragons and their riders in the weirs and the people in the cave holdings went about their separate tasks, and each developed habits that became custom, which solidified into tradition as incontrovertible as law. By the third pass of the Red Star, a complicated social, political, and economic structure had developed to deal with the recurrent evil of thread. There was now 6 wers pledged to protect all Pern, each wer having a geographical section of the northern continent literally under its wings. The rest of the population, the holds, agreed to tithe to support the weirs, since these fighters, these dragon men, did not have any arable land in their volcanic homes, nor did they have time for farming while protecting the planet from passes of the thread. Holds developed wherever natural caves could be found. Some, of course, were extensive or strategically placed near good water and grazing. Others were smaller and less well placed. It took a strong man to keep frantic, terrified people in control of the holds during threat attacks. It took wise administration to conserve food supplies for times when nothing could be safely grown. Extraordinary measures controlled population, keeping its number healthy and useful until such time as the thread should pass. And often children from one hold were raised in another hold to spread the genetic pool and keep the holds from dangerous inbreeding. Such a practice was called fostering and was used in both hold and craft halls, where special skills such as metalworking, animal breeding, farming, fishing, and mining, such as there was, were preserved. So that one lord holder could not deny the products of a craft hall situated in its hold to others, the crafts were decreed independent of the hold affiliation, each craft master at a hall owning allegiance only to the master of that particular craft, who, as the need arose, took likely students in as fosterlings. Except for the return of the Red Star approximately every 200 years, life was pleasant on Pern. There came a time when the Red Star, due to the conjunction of Rukbar's 5 natural satellites, did not pass close enough to Pern to drop the dreadful spores, and the Pernies forgot about the danger. The people prospered, spreading out across the rich land, carving more holds out of solid rock and becoming so busy with their pursuance that they did not realize that there were only a few dragons in the skies, and only weir of dragon riders left on Pern. In a few generations, the descendants of the holders began to wonder if the Red Star would ever return. The dragon riders fell into disfavor. Why should all Pern support these people and their hungry beasts? The legends of past braveries and the very reason for such courage became dishonored. But in the natural course of events, the Red Star again spun close to Pern, winking with a baleful red eye on its intended victim. One man, Falar, rider of the bronze dragon Menmeth, believed that the ancient tales had truth in them. His half-brother, Fënor, rider of brown Canth, listened to his arguments and came to believe. When the last golden egg of a dying queen dragon lay hardening in the Bendon Ware hatchling ground, Falar and Fënor seized the opportunity to gain control of the Ware. Searching Rotha Hold, they found a strong woman, Lessa, the only surviving member of the proud bloodline of Rotha Hold. She impressed young Ramoth, the new queen, and became weirwoman of Bendon Wire, and Falar's bronze Menmeth became the new queen's mate. The 3 young riders, Falar, Fënor, and Lessa, forced the lord holders and the craftsmen to recognize their imminent danger and prepare the almost defenseless planet against threat. But it was distressingly obvious that the scant 200 dragons of Bendon Ware could not defend the widespread and sprawling settlements. 6 full weirs had been needed in the golden days, when the settled land had been much less extensive. In learning to direct her queen between one place and another, Lessa discovered that dragons could teleport between time as well. Risking her life as well as Pern's only queen, Lessa and Ramoth went back in time 400 turns to the days before the mysterious disappearance of the other 5 weirs, just after the last pass of the Red Star had been completed. Only 5 weirs, the 5 weirs, seeing only the decline of their prestige and bored and with inactivity after a lifetime of exciting combat, agreed to help Lessa and Pern and came forward into her time. So heavy. Okay. A dragon song begins 7 turns after the 5 weirs came forward. So obviously this is like a spin-off novel of a vast Anne McCaffrey legacy world. It's very big. But this is a very, small, lighthearted novel, but the rest of them are like, this big. So basically what happened, they colonized a planet. There was another planet that came every couple of years and rained down thread, what is called thread. It's actually, it's like kills everything with fire and acid that it touches except caves. So they decided to invest in that and to move into caves. And so there's different structures of government involved: the holders, the wires, the craft holders, Guys, do you have any questions? No, no questions. Okay, so I'll get started with chapter 1 then. Drummer beat and piper blow, harper strike and soldier go, free the flame and sear the grasses till the dawning red star passes. Almost as if the elements too mourned the death of the gentle old harper, a southeaster blew for 3 days, locking even the burial barge in the safety of the dock cavern. The storm gave sea-holder Janus too much time to brood over his dilemma. It gave him time to speak to every man who could keep rhythm and pitch, and they all give him the same answer. They couldn't properly honor the old harper with his death song, that Menelly could. To which answer Janus would grunt and stamp off. It rankled in his mind that he couldn't give voice to his dissatisfaction with that answer and his frustration. Menelly was only a girl, too tall and lanky to be a proper girl at that. It galled him to have to admit that. Unfortunately, she was the only person in the entire half-circle sea-hold who could play any instrument as well as the old harper. Her voice was true, her fingers clever on string, stick, or pipe, and she knew the death song. For all Janus could be certain, the aggravating child had been practicing that song ever since old Petrion started burning with his fatal fever. "You will have to do the honor, Janus," his wife Mavi told him the evening the storm began to slacken. "The important thing is that Petrion is properly sung to rest. One does not have to record who did the singing." The old man knew he was dying. Why didn't he instruct one of the men? "Because," replied Mavi with a touch of sharpness in her voice, "you would never spare him a man when they were fishing. There was young Trelawny, whom you sent fostering to Ista Seahold. Couldn't that young lad of Forolt's?" His voice is changing. "Come, Janus, it'll have to be Menolli." Janus grumbled bitterly against the inevitable as he climbed into the sleeping furs. "That's what everyone else has told you, haven't they? So why make so much of a necessity?" Janus settled himself, resigned. "The fishing will be good tomorrow," his wife said, yawning. She preferred him fishing to stomping around the hold, sullen and critical with enforced inactivity. She knew he was the finest sea-holder Half-Circle had ever had. The hold was prospering, with plenty of bartering set by in the storage caves. They hadn't lost a ship or a man in several turns either, which said much for his weathered wisdom. But Janus, at home on a heaving deck in foul weather, was very much adrift when taxed with the unexpected on land. Mavi was keenly aware that Janus was displeased with his youngest child. Mavi found the girl exasperating too. Menelly worked hard and was very clever with her fingers, too clever by half when it came to playing any instrument in the harper craft. Perhaps, Mavi thought, she had not been wise to permit the girl to linger in the old harper's constant company once she had learned all the proper teaching songs. But it had been one less worry to let Menolli nurse the old harper, and Petrion had wished it. No one begrudged a harper's requests. "Oh, well," thought Mavi, dismissing the past, "there'd be a new harper soon, and Menelly could be put to task proper to a young girl." The next morning the storm had cleared off. The skies were cloudless, the sea calm. The burial barge had been outfitted in the dock cavern, Petrion's body wrapped in harper blue on the tilter board. The entire fleet and most of the sea-hold followed in the wake of the oar-driven barge, out into the faster-moving current above Nerat Deep. Menelly, on the barge prow, sang the elegy, her clear, strong voice carrying back to the half-circle fleet the men chattering the descent as they rowed the barge. On the final chord, Petrion went to his rest. Menelly bowed her head and let drum and stick slide from her fingers into the sea. How could she ever use them again when they had beaten Petrion's last song? She'd held back her tears since the harper had died because she knew she had to be able to sing his elegy, and you couldn't sing with a throat closed from crying. Now the tears ran down her cheeks, mingled with sea spray, her sobs punctuated by the soft chant of the steersman setting about. Petrion had been her friend, her ally and mentor. She had sung from the heart as he taught her, from the heart and the gut. Had he heard her song where he had gone? She raised her eyes to the palisades of the coast, the white sanded harbor between the two arms of the half-circle hold. The sky had wept itself out in the past 3 days, a fitting tribute, and the air was cold. She shivered in her thick, wet rear-hide jacket, and would have some protection from the wind if she had stepped down into the cockpit with the oarsmen. But she couldn't move. Honor was always accompanied by responsibility, and it was fitting for her to remain where she was until the burial barge touched the stones of Dock Cavern. Half Circle Hold will be lonelier than ever for her now. Petrion had tried so hard to live long enough for his replacement to arrive. He told Meneley he wouldn't last the winter. He dispatched a message to Master Harper Robinson to send a new harper as soon as possible. He'd also told Meneley that he'd sent 2 of her songs to the Master Harper. Women can't be harpers, she'd said to Petrion, astonished and awed. 1 in 10,000 have perfect pitch, Petrion said in one of his evasive replies. 1 in 10,000 can build an acceptable melody with meaningful words. Were you only a lad, there'd be no problem at all. Well, we're stuck with me being a girl. You'd make a fine, big, strong lad, you would, Petrion had replied exasperatingly. And what's wrong with being a fine, big, strong girl? Meneley had been half teasing, half annoyed. Nothing, surely nothing, said Petrion, and as he patted her hand, smiling up at her. She'd been helping him eat his dinner, his hands so crippled even the lightest wooden spoon left terrible ridges in his swollen fingers. Master Harper Robinson's a fair man. No one on Pern can say he isn't. And he'll listen to me. He knows his duty, and I am, after all, a senior member of the craft hall, being taught up in the craft before him himself, and I'll require him to listen to you. Have you really sent him those songs you made me wax down on slates? I have. Sure, I have done that much for you, dear child. He'd been so emphatic that Meneley had to believe that he'd done what he'd said. Poor old Petron, in the last months, he'd not remembered the time of turn, much less what he'd done the day before. He was timeless now, Meneley told herself, her wet cheeks stinging with cold, and she'd never forget him. The shadow of the 2 arms of Half Circle's cliffs fell across her face. The barge was entering the home harbor. She lifted her head high above. Just a minute. No, you have to be in your bed. I'm not going to stand for that. Turn your light off. Okay. The barge was entering the home harbor. She lifted her head. High above, she saw the diminutive outline of a dragon in the sky. How lovely! And how had Brendan Wire known? No, the dragon rider was only doing a routine sweep. With thread falling at unexpected times, dragons were often flying above Half Circle, isolated as it was by the bogs at the top of Nerat Bay. No matter, the dragon was awing above Half Circle Hold at this appropriate moment, and that was, to Meneley, the final tribute to Petrion, the harper. The men lifted the heavy oars out of the water, and the barge glided slowly to its mooring at the far end of the dock. Fort Antillic might boast of being the oldest sea holds, but only Half Circle had a cavern big enough to dock the entire fishing fleet and keep it safe from threadfall and weather. Dock Cavern had moorings for 30 boats, storage space for all the nets, traps, and linens, airing racks for sail, and the shallow ledge where hulls could be scraped free of sea growths and repaired. At the very end of the immense cavern was a shelf of rock where the hold's builders worked when there was sufficient timber for a new hull. Beyond was the small inner cave where priceless wood was stored, dried on high racks or wrapped or warped into frames. The burial barge lightly touched its pier. Meneley, the first oarsman, held out a hand to her. Startled by the unexpected courtesy to a girl her age, she was about to jump down when she saw in his eyes the respect due her at this moment, and his hand, closing on hers, gave silent approval for her singing for the harper's elegy. The other men stood too, waiting for her to disembark first. She straightened her shoulders, although her throat felt tight enough for more tears, and she stepped proudly down to the solid stone. As she turned to walk back to the land side, of the cavern, she saw that the other boats were discharging their passengers quickly and quietly. Her father's boat, the biggest of the half-circle fleet, had already tacked back into the harbor. Giannis's voice carried across the water above the incidental sounds of creaking boats and muted voices. Quickly now, men, we've a good breeze rising and the fish will be biting after 3 days of storm. The oarsmen hurried past her to board their assigned fishing boats. It seemed unfair to Manoli that Petrion, after a long life's dedication to Half Circle Hold, was dismissed so quickly from everyone's mind, and yet life did go on. There were fish to be caught against winter's hungry months. Fair days during the cold months of the turn were not to be squandered. She quickened her pace. She'd far to go around the rim of the dock cavern, and she was cold. Manoli also wanted to get into the hold before her mother noticed that she didn't have the drum. Waste wasn't tolerated by Mavi any more than idleness by Giannis. While this was an occasion, it had been a sad one, and the women and children, and also the men too old to see fish, observed a decorous pace out of the cavern, making smaller groups as they headed towards their own holds in the southern arc of Half Circle's sheltering palisade. Manoli saw Mavi organizing the children into work groups. With no Harper to lead them into the teaching songs and the ballads, the children would be kept occupied in clearing the storm's debris from the white sanded beaches. There might be sun in the sky, and the dragon riders still circling in his brown, but the wind was frigid, and Manoli began to shiver violently. She wanted to feel the warmth of the fire on the great Hold's kitchen hearth and a cup of hot claw inside her. She heard her sister Sella's voice carrying on the breeze. She's got nothing to do now, Mavi. Why do I have to? Manoli ducked behind a group of adults, avoiding her mother's searching glance. Trust Sella to remember that Manoli no longer had the excuse of nursing the ailing Harper. Ahead of her, one of the old aunts tripped, her querulous voice raised in a cry for help. Manoli sprinted to her side, supporting her and receiving loud protestations of gratitude. Only for Petrion would I have dragged these old bones out of the cold sea this morning. Bless the man, rest the man, the old woman went on, clinging with unexpected strength to Manoli. You're a good child, Manoli. So you are. Is it? It is Manoli, isn't it? The old one peered up at her. Now, you just give me a hand up to old uncle, and I'll tell him the whole of it, since he hasn't legs to leave his bed. So Sella had to supervise the children, and Manoli got to the fire at least long enough to stop shivering. Then old auntie would have to have it that the uncle would be grateful for some claw too. So when Mavi entered her kitchen, her eyes searching for her youngest daughter, she found Bentley dutifully occupying serving the oldster. Very well then, Menely. While you're up there, see that you set the old man comfortably. Then you can start on the glows. Menely had her warming cup with the old uncle and left him comfortable, mournfully exchanging tales of their burials with the aunt. Checking the checking the glows had been her task ever since she had grown taller than Sella. It had meant climbing up and down the different levels to the inner and outer layers of the huge sea hold, but Menely had established the quickest way to finish the job so that she'd have some free time to herself before Mavi started looking for her. She'd been accustomed to spending those earned minutes practicing with the harper, so Menely was not surprised to find herself eventually outside Petrion's door. She was surprised, however, to hear voices in his room. She was about to charge angrily through the half-open door and demand an accounting when she heard her mother's voice clearly. The room won't need much fixing for the new harper, so it won't. Menely stepped back into the shadow of the corridor. The new harper? What I want to know, Mavi, is who is to keep the children up in the learning until he comes? That voice was Sorel's, the wife of the first holder and therefore spokeswoman for the other hold women to Mavi as the sea holder's lady. She did well enough this morning. You have to give her that, Mavi. Giannis will send the message ship. Not today, nor tomorrow he won't. I don't fault Sea Holder Mavi, but it stands to reason the boats must fish, and the slop's crew can't be spared. That means 4 or 5 days before the messenger gets to Eingenhold. From Eingenhold, if the dragon rider obliges by carrying the message. But We all know that the old timers in Eigenwehr are like to, let's say, Harper drums to the Master Harper Hall at Fort is another 2, 3 days. A man has to be selected by Master Harper Robinson and sent overland by ship. And with a thread falling any time it pleases, no one travels fast or far in a day. It'll be spring before we see another Harper. Are the children to be left without teaching for months? Sorrel had punctuated her comments with brushing sounds, and there were other clatters in the room, the swishing of bed rushes being gathered up. Now Manoli could hear the murmur of two other voices supporting Sorrel's arguments. Petrion has taught well. He taught her well too, Sorrel interrupted Mavi. Harpering is a man's occupation. Fair enough if Sea Holder'll spare a man for it. Sorrel's voice was almost belligerent because everyone knew the answer to that. Truth be told, I think the girl knew the sagas better than the old man this past turn. You know his mind was ranging back in time, Mavi. The second. Giannis will do what's proper. The finality in Mavi's tone firmly ended that discussion. Manily heard footsteps crossing the old Harper's room, and she ducked down the hall, around the nearest bend, and down into the kitchen level. It distressed Manily to think of anyone, even another Harper, in Petrion's room. Obviously, it distressed others that there was no Harper. Usually, such a problem didn't arise. Every hold could boast one or two musically able men, and every hold took pride in encouraging these talents. Harpers like to have other instrumentalists to share the chore of entertaining their holds during the long winter evenings. And it was also the better part of wisdom to have a substitute available for just such an emergency as Half Circle was experiencing. But fishing was hard on the hands, the heavy work, the cold water, the salt and fish oils thickened joints and calloused fingers in the wrong places. Fishermen were often away many days on longer hauls. After a turn or two at net, trap, and sail line, young men lost their skill at playing anything but simple tunes. Harper teaching ballads required deft, quick fingers and constant practice. By putting to sea to finish so quickly after the old Harper's burial, Giannis thought to have time enough to find an alternative solution. There was no doubt that the girl could sing well, play well, and she'd not disgraced Hold or Harper that morning. It was not it was going to take time to send for and receive a new Harper, and the youngsters must not lose all progress in the learning of the basic teaching ballads. But Giannis had many strong reservations about putting such a heavy responsibility on the shoulders of a girl not 15 turns old. Not the least of these was Minally's distressing tendency toward tune making. Well enough and amusing now and again in the long winter evenings to hear her sing them, but old Petrion had been alive to keep her to rights. Giannis wasn't sure that he could trust her not to include her trivial little whistles in the lessons. How were the young to know that hers weren't proper songs for their learning? The trouble was, her melodies were the sort that stayed in the mind, so a man found himself humming or whistling them without meaning to. By the time the boats had profitably trawled the deep and tacked for home, Giannis had found no compromise. It was no consolation to know that he wouldn't have any argument from the other holders. Had Manily sung poorly that morning, but she hadn't. As the sea holder of Half Circle, he was obliged to bring up the young of the hold in the traditions of Pern, knowing their duty and how to do it. He counted himself very lucky to be beholden of Bendenwehr, to have Falar, Bronze Menment's rider, as weir leader, and Lessa as Remus weir woman. So Giannis felt deeply obliged to keep tradition at Half Circle, and the young would learn what they needed to know, even if a girl had the teaching. That evening, after the day's catch had been salted down, he instructed Mavi to bring her daughter to the small room of the great cave where he conducted whole business and where the records were stored. Mavi had put the Harper's instruments on the mantel for safekeeping. Appropriately, Giannis handed Menely Petrion's guitar, and she took the instrument in a properly reverential manner, which reassured Giannis that she appreciated the responsibility. Tomorrow, you'll be excused from your regular morning duties to take the youngsters for their teaching, he told her. but I'll have no more of those finger twiddlings of yours. I sang my songs when Petrion was alive, and you never minded them. Giannis frowned down at his tall daughter. Petrion was alive. He's dead now, and you'll obey me in this. Over her father's shoulders, Menelly saw her mother's frowning face, saw her warning head shake, and held back a quick reply. You bear in mind what I've said, and Giannis fingered the wide belt he wore. No toning. Yes, Giannis. Start tomorrow then, unless, of course, there's Threadfall, and then everyone will bait longlines. Giannis dismissed the two women and began to compose a message to the master harper to go when he could next spare the sloop's crew. They'd sail it to Injun Hold about time Half Circle had some news of the rest of Pern anyway, and he could ship some of the smoked fish. The journey needn't be a wasted trip. Once in the hallway, Mavi gripped her daughter's arm hard. Don't disobey him, girl. There's no harm in my tunes, Mother. You know what Petrion said. I'll remind you that the old man's dead, and that changes everything that went on during his life. Behave yourself while you stand in a man's place. No tuning. To bed now, and mind you turn the glow baskets. No sense wasting light. No eye needs. That was the end of chapter 1, and as I read a very long forward and a very long first chapter, I think that we are probably going to call it for tonight. Even though it is only 8:55, I am not used to reading out loud this much. And the next chapter, chapter 2, first word is honor. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 pages, and these pages are like, look, they're full. And the print is really small. So we will read chapter 2 tomorrow. And
Stranger says howdy. So I say howdy.
I hope you guys enjoyed it. And sorry it's kind of short tonight, but my voice is almost gone.
We'll make it longer later.
Yeah. All right.
Make sure and finish before I go to Virginia.
Yeah. And I'm going to make a tradition of doing this in my pajamas because I think it's a nice end of the night pajama party thing. Plus, I just love pajamas.
So,
I love pajamas.
So the story is because what happened when we lived in Killeen, we had the kids' bedrooms were off in this hallway. So we had the boys slept in this one room, and it was down a hallway, and then everybody else was down this other hallway. And so when we put the boys to bed, they would always get out of bed, and so I started sitting sentry outside the I had like a sentry duty outside of their room, and so I got kind of bored with that, and while I was waiting for them to go to sleep, because we didn't want them like just ransacking the house while we were thinking that they were sleeping. So I started reading, and I actually I don't know what we started with. And I know we read the Thrawn trilogy from Star Wars. I know we read Secret Garden.
Yeah.
We read Lord of the Rings. We read all of the Narnia books. Well, Thrawn trilogy doesn't fit my guidelines for the live stream. And I'm sure that we read a few other books too, but and Harry Potter. Actually, we were almost all the way through Harry Potter when we moved, and so I actually had to finish Harry Potter in Germany. So that's the story of our nighttime reading time. And it just became a tradition. I remember one day I was reading Lord of the Rings, and I had to put my bulletproof vest together for a for an inspection the next day. And so I had all the pieces because that's the way they gave it to me at CIF. And I had all the pieces out in the living room. I was supposed to watch a YouTube video so I could figure out how to put it together. So that evening, while I was reading Lord of the Rings, Ben just did it for me. He was like probably maybe Daniel's age at the oldest.
Like 10 or 12.
He was like 10 or 12 years old. He put, yeah, well, what you could do is pay attention, then you'd know what you did. Ha 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 ha. So yeah, so he just put the whole thing together for me, and I checked it, and everything was right, and I did great. So that was awesome, and we just want him to pay attention to the story as much as he did then. He also did the Star Wars puzzle that was like almost impossible because it was all outer space, and he did that while I was reading. So it was some pretty good times. Anyway, I hope that you enjoy the reading time that we have, and I hope that you're able to, maybe you can do a puzzle, maybe you can put a bulletproof vest together. I don't know. Whatever it is that you're able to do while we're reading, that's what I hope is constructive for you. So, Daniel, what you can do is you can lay in your bed. I told you could work on your Rubik's Cube. So, with that said, it is time for bed. I'm a poet and didn't know it. And I'm going to let you go. And God bless you. Have a great night. And we will. Look, I'm being choked. All right. Have a great night. And we will see you again tomorrow for Heavy D storytelling. Good night.